that iPod over here walks over here and says, oh, I never heard this, and goes that way. And not listening says, they should tell us about this stuff, and goes this way. And the other people say, you know, oh, I hadn't heard this, and oh yeah, I remember they told us about this. And these guys are like, whatever, and they go through this door anyway. Now what happens is I collect my data on what's going on in this room. How many failures do I see? I see a bunch of them, but how many people do they come from? Now I know where to go when I want to do something extra. I've got this much extra time I could spend helping kids with door issues. Okay? This much time out of my life to spend on door issues. If I spend it on 7 kids, every kid gets this much. If I put this sign on the door, I've got 2 kids and they both get this much. I can give a lot more time to my red zone when I've spent time on green first and yellow second. Red will still get what they need, but they'll get more of what they need because there are fewer of them. So we want people to continually think, what's the next simplest thing I could do to make even more kids successful? But you can dig a moat over here and put up a barbed wire fence, have attack dogs. These 2 people are going to figure out a way to go through that door. That's what they do. They're red zone kids. So we have to figure out what do we need to prevent to figure out who those kids are, and then what do we do for these kids? Now these kids are going to need a lot more. They need the most intense, direct, explicit instruction we could possibly give them. These are the kids that I'm going to walk over to this door one-on-one and say, door, no. This door, no. Because just saying don't use the door is not enough, and even talking to them, they need it the most explicit it can possibly be. These kids are going to need plans for crises, because they're going to take an axe and break that door down at some point, and we're going to have a crisis plan in place. These kids will definitely need something like special ed. I think a lot of these kids will too, but definitely here. And these kids, what we have to realize is, are bigger than the school. We've got all these great things in the school to use, and these kids will need all of it. But they'll also need help from other things, other agencies, the community at large. These kids absolutely have to have involvement from mental health, family counseling, medical people, nutritionists, the whole range. Extended family needs to be involved. We need wraparound for the red zone kids. Now, you all know what wraparound is? Familiar with wraparound? Wraparound is extremely expensive, time-consuming, complicated, and effective. But the only way it's going to be effective is if we can apply it to the kids that need it. And if all of the kids in this row need it, we're going to blow up trying to give it to them. So if we can prevent here and only give RAP to these 2 kids, we can do that, and we can do it really well. That's why we have to start with green. Because at this point, a lot of schools, when I'm talking to them about this, will say, I like what you're saying, but we've got a bunch of these kids, so let's just go after this right now. And if this gets in place, then we'll try this other stuff. The problem is, you're going to be doing this across a zillion kids. And while you're doing it across those kids, you're not focusing here. New kids are going to be joining in with this carousel every day. So we've got to figure out a way to stop the joining of the red before we start working on the red. It'll happen simultaneously, but if green and yellow aren't in place, red will get out of control. Here's an example of the way we've used this model just for reading. Just because I want to show you the model isn't just a behavior model. When I was at Florida, we had a research grant called Reading and Behavior Model Demo System. And what we did is we did the behavior part that I've just shown you. These are elementary schools. My colleague, Holly Lane at Florida, was a reading specialist, and she developed the reading component. So let's put it together the same way we do PBS. You have to choose what you're going to do across all your kids. We don't choose it for you, you choose. You pick a research-based reading program that all of you want to use. We don't care what it is, as long as you guys found it, agreed on it, and it's something that you didn't pull out of the back of Rolling Stone or something. It's got to be a research-based program. They picked their things. Then we said, okay, So you picked, what are your kids' problems? What are you going to do about it? And they said these things. Part 3, how do we make sure you're all on board? Well, we're going to get together, we're going to vote, we're going to decide this is what we're doing, and we're going to go after it as a school. 4th, data. How will you know if it's working? So we said very early in the year we're going to need to start collecting data. We're not going to wait till the end of the year. Let's do a DIBELS test, DIBELS, Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. Let's do that real early in the year. So school starts in mid-August in Florida. So in mid-September we did our first DIBELS. The kids that weren't reading up to the state benchmark were yellow, regardless of where they fell on that continuum. If you're not reading at state benchmark, we consider you all yellow right now. So there's this whole group of people. For all of these people who weren't reading at the benchmark, we gave the teachers a bag of tricks. So I shouldn't say we, Holly gave the teachers a bag of tricks. Find kids on the DIBELS that have these kinds of problems, use these things for them. Find kids with these problems, and she just gave them a list of things. So she didn't say, if this, you must do this. She said, find things that fit your teaching style, find things that feel good to you, but make sure that your data links kid to strategy, problem to strategy, the logic. Then we did another DIBELS. And we found that when we did the DIBELS a second time, that some of these kids started making progress. And a small number didn't. So those became our red zone kids. Those kids are kids we referred for special ed, and, not always, but vast majority of the time, and we trained individual tutors to work with those kids. Now, how did we involve the community at the reading level? We trained grandparents and parent volunteers and other community volunteers to be individual tutors, and we let the community help us with this. In other words, at the red level, it's getting bigger than just what the school needs. Let's involve more of the community when we get to the red level. So that's the model. Now, then the question becomes data. These are the pyramids that we've built for these schools as we've staggered implementation over the years. And you can see that as we've put things in place, the green zone, which equals percent of kids reading at the state benchmark for their grade level, K through 3. So you can see as the years go by, we continue to increase the number of kids reading at the state benchmark. Now, if that's really true, that we're doing that, the red and yellow zones you would think would be changing too. But what we're finding is that the yellow zones don't change in numbers. Green goes up, red comes down, yellow stays about the same, which means we're having more success, we're using less special ed, but we're doing more pre-referral type things. And that's exactly what we found. Now here's the data on referrals for special ed. When we put reading in as a proactive system, what we found was that referral rates for special ed started dropping dramatically. The funny thing was, this was not just a drop in LD referrals. It was also a drop in emotional behavior disorder referrals and a drop in mild mental impairment, the old EMR category. Also a drop there, which really is striking to me, because what that says to me is, before we started doing this with these schools were putting kids in special ed that really weren't special ed kids, that just kids that hadn't been successful. When you make them successful, they're not special ed. In other words, these kids didn't have disabilities. They hadn't been taught sufficiently. So what we're being able to demonstrate over and over now nationally is things like this. The best predictor we have of a kid who's going to have more than 5 office referrals at 5th grade is a kid that has a low score on the phonemic segmentation component of DIBELS in kindergarten. In other words, kids that aren't good with academics are going to have behavior problems. I guess it's a correlation, so you could say it the other way. Kids with behavior problems are going to have poor academic skills. It's a chicken and egg, and it doesn't really matter which started which. The idea is PBS has to be concerned with making kids successful in school. And academics should make up 80% of what they do, so academics is a huge component of making kids successful. And the people that say, you got to get all the behavior under control before you do academics, are missing the point about what success means. We have to create that success. Shepard Kellum, a researcher at Johns Hopkins University, we have a collaborative reading grant with them too. Shep's come up with this model that says, if you teach nothing but reading and do it extremely well, your kids will gain in reading to this level. And if you don't do anything with behavior, it'll come up a little bit too, just because the reading was doing so well. If you teach nothing but behavior and do a great job with behavior management, you can make behavior happen. And reading actually will come along a little bit just from keeping kids in there. What happens if you teach reading and behavior? The research says reading and behavior, you get this. You get a bonus effect on each of them. Reading instruction that makes kids successful makes behavior better. Behavior instruction makes reading better. Do them both, we get successful kids. Now reading is the key, because if you can't read, you can't do any of the other subjects, but every subject really is the same. How do we make kids successful with everything we do? And if we do that, it comes back to help us. So in Baltimore, we actually went through and calculated it out. It takes 20 minutes for the average referral, for an administrator to deal with that referral. It takes 45 minutes for the average suspension for the administrator. So if that's the case, here's the way we calculate. We say, here's how many referrals the school had last year, here's how many suspensions they had last year, here's how many minutes they spent. Put PBS in place. When those things go down, what did they save? And we figured out in this elementary school, the administrator saved back 14.5 days. Now, if you're the administrator in this school and you just saved 14.5 days, what are you going to do with all that extra time? Clean your office, go to Starbucks, do something. Or what if you looked at your data and said, so where are the kids that are still having problems? When is that happening? What's going on? And you went out and you spent more time in those areas. So, hey, I've got no one waiting to see me in my office. I think I'll go stand by the cafeteria door right now. Reinvest that time and you get a bigger increase the following year. Oh, that was right. We calculated out in terms of money for what we pay people, but we also looked at it for kid time. We saved back kid hours, because that 20 minutes was also time a kid spent away. And we found that we can increase, in a school like this, for instance, we get about 60 days worth of time back. Time that kids were suspended or sitting in the office. Who gets those 60 days? Who lost them in the first place? Those 60 days were lost by this group of kids. So when we get 60 days back, it doesn't go to everybody. It's coming back to these kids, and these are the kids that need it. So when we use PBS, we can demonstrate that we save time, kids spend more time in the classroom. But my last thought for you is this. Just because kids are in the classroom doesn't mean they're going to be learning more. We have to use that time they're back in the classroom effectively and efficiently to teach them something. So that's what I want to give you for the big ideas. What we're going to do for the rest of the day is we're going to talk about using data to figure out who these kids are before it's painfully obvious. Because if we all sit down right now, you could all name 3 kids. If you all worked at the same school and I say, name 3 kids, you're all naming the exact same 3 kids. It's too late to prevent. We're going to do things for those kids. It's too late to prevent. I want to know how we keep a whole nother group of kids from becoming them. So first thing we have to do is figure out who those kids are. We're going to figure out how to use data to do that. And then we'll spend the rest of the day after that saying, then what do we do with those kids? And we'll talk about intervention strategies that use assessment data for those kids. So why don't we take a 15-minute break here, and we'll come back in 15 minutes and begin the next component. Assistance Center, and we share all this data, and some of it they give to me and say, give it to anybody you want, and some of they say, show it to people, but don't give it to people yet because we might publish it. And so I've given you most of what I can give you. There are a few other things that I could give you, and I will be glad to distribute that. Anything that I have available that I own to give to you, you can have. I don't have anything for sale, so if there's something you want, please do ask. And I would be glad to get it to you if it's available to me to give. A couple of things that I want to hit before we move forward. One is that I know, or I've found out, that not all of you have been PBS schools or possibly even know what PBS is. So let me ask this before we go further. How many of you are in schools that are doing something that's PBS related? Okay. For the rest of you, let me just very briefly tell you what PBS is. I just described PBS this morning. PBS is simply a way of getting the entire school to buy into a system of what will our rules be and what are we going to do to make kids successful with those rules. And we use that school-wide system to prevent, and then we have a school-wide data collection system that we use to identify times and places where we're still having problems and to identify kids that are having problems. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that data collection system right as we get started this morning. The second thing that I want to hit on is the fact that the data that I've been showing you and the examples I've been giving you don't always match exactly to the population that you have. And that's simply because I don't have examples of those things. However, here are some things I want you to be aware of. One, whether you are reading at level X, level Y, or level Z, the issue is the same. How do we make you continue to be successful with whatever it is we're teaching? So it doesn't really matter if, when I talked about the Dibble scores, those Dibble scores are for kids that are on a trajectory going from here to here. If your kids are on a trajectory starting here and going to here, there's a different set of steps that will be success for them. As long as we're being successful in whatever it is we're teaching, the concept remains exactly the same. The other thing that's going to come up over and over again today is a whole bunch of examples that I have of kids that make noises. And I was reminded that that's not as big an issue with your kids as it is with some of the kids. I'm hoping again that you can kind of extrapolate the example of a kid that's being disruptive, whether they're making a noise or doing whatever it is they're doing, they're being disruptive, and that we can talk about them the same way. So I kind of urge you to kind of bear with me and kind of be able to think through how these could be the same, because I do think the concept will apply to whoever we're talking about. Okay, so moving on. If you want to know what's going on in your school, the data that we have says the best data we have, the best indicators we have of kids' problem behaviors are teachers. If you really want to know who's having problems, when, where, and why, go into a school and ask people, and they'll tell you. The problem we have when we look at the whole school is each of you sees the school from your context. I'm at this hallway at this time of day, in this place at this time of day, and over here with these kids. So when you say to me, what are our biggest problems? I'm going to say this kid and that kid in these places at this time. But somebody else is seeing a different set of kids at different times under different conditions in different places. So when we all get together, we might all have slightly different ideas. The one thing we'll all agree on are those 3 or 4 red zone kids that we all know cut across everything we do. But if we already know who these 2 kids, oh, you guys have mixed me up here. If we already know who those 2 kids are, how do we find the others? That's our question. And to do that, we're going to need to have some sort of system in our school. I'm going to demonstrate for you a simple way of figuring some of this out. Now, let me tell you, to do the things we're going to do the rest of the day, you don't have to have this data system. I want you to be aware of the data system because I think using whatever data you do have school-wide makes you more efficient at finding and being proactive with the kids that need it. So, if you are going to have some sort of data about what's going on with kids in your school, how do we make it work for you? There are 3 things that need to be in place for it to work. One is, whatever data you have to be accurate. So if we all sat together and I said, how many fights have there been? If you thought a fight meant somebody punched someone in the nose and it was bleeding, and you thought a fight meant somebody called someone a name, we don't have accurate data. Because you're going to say, I've seen 1,000 of them, and you're going to say, I've seen 2. That really isn't an accurate comparison. So somehow we all have to agree on what things are in the school. So if I'm going to say, how many times did that kid have problem? Well, we all have to agree on what that problem is. So if I said to this group, how many times do you have kids that are disrespectful? Well, I think we all know disrespect when we see it, but that's a real hard thing to define. And some teachers have a real low tolerance, and some have a high. So we have to just decide as a group, at what level of behavior will we decide that's disrespectful? So we all are talking about the same thing. What's a fight? What's a disruption? So we need to have definitions. Second, if we're going to ask you all as a school to collect data and put something in writing in numbers, it's got to be simple. We believe that if we ask you as a school to collect data on your kids with problem behaviors, that system has to take less than 1% of your time, or you don't have time to do it. In other words, your data needs to work for you. If you're working for your data, you're wasting your time. So it's got to be simple. Third, it's got to be useful. You can collect all the data you want, and you can do it really well and really accurately, and if you never use it for anything, then why are you collecting all that data? I do see schools once in a while that'll collect all kinds of data, and I'll ask them what it says, and they'll say, well, we've never really looked at it. Then why are you collecting it? That's a complete waste of your time. So it's got to be useful. We want to look at it and say, what does this tell us? So I think you need to have some questions ahead of time, too. Let me go ahead here for a second. Here's a really scary looking piece of paper. This piece of paper is something that a school uses to monitor when a problem behavior occurred. Here's why it's not as scary as it looks. All this says is, this entire area here says, where did this happen? That entire area requires one check mark. So I say, I saw a kid have a problem behavior. Check where it happened. This says it happened in the 5th grade hallway. So for your school, if you wanted to have a good database of what's going on in your school, you're going to want to know, what are your locations? So every school is going to have different locations. What'd they do? What are these? What does it mean, pushing and shoving? Well, that one's pretty easy. You pushed, you shoved, that's... But what is a mild obscene gesture? This is a real school's thing, so I don't know. But that's what they have. What is defiance? If you say, would you please do this? And they say, no, you can't make me. Is that defiance or is that worse than defiance? So there's got to be some definitions here from us to know what's happening. So what they've asked is, if you see a child having a problem behavior, you might refer them to the office. What we would like is one standard form that we all use, so that when this goes to the office, we're all looking at the same thing. Now we could put these into a database. So what we do is we take this form, and when it comes to the office, we get on a computer and we just have a spreadsheet and we just enter what we saw. What we've done in our schools is we say, do this every Friday afternoon, once a week. Enter your data for the week. It doesn't take more than about 10 minutes to put it all in. Once you enter it, if we have a good spreadsheet, oh, here's another example of one of these. This one is, actually I think I have one of them in here. Let me see just a second. This is the sheet that this school uses for problem behaviors. It goes in your pocket, it's very small. It includes all that information. Who was it? What time was it? What was the problem? Where did it happen? What did you do about it? What did the office do? I carry this around. Everybody carries the exact same thing. So all the data that comes to the office is the same. Now what this school has done, you can see this is yellow and blue. The other side is a little slip that says, you soared today. I don't know why it says you soared today. This must have something to do with the bees that this school's mascot. So these little sheets are worth how much money do you think? No money. These sheets just say it's a more salient way of kids that come in with a lot of problems, a more salient way of reminding them they're doing it right. So I walk down the hall and I say, yesterday you were running. You're doing a great job. Thank you for doing a great job of walking today. And I hand you one of those. Now you take that back and show it to your teacher, take it home, show it to your parents. That's it. It's acknowledgement. It's not anything more than just a more salient way of me saying, you did a great job. What's neat is this school gives one of these to every teacher. The blue section is 4 times bigger than the yellow section. That's a reminder to adults. Also, say things nice to kids. So if I run out of all my yellows and still have all my blues, it's a reminder to me I need to be watching for kids to do it right more often and letting them know. So that's a simple way to do this. If we do that, here's a spreadsheet, one that I made up. I'm sorry, yes.
On the blue and the yellow.
Yes.
Does anyone actually chart the number of blues that were used and see if that, if just the number of blues that are used is making a difference?
Most schools, the question is, we ask schools to look at the yellows and keep a record of what's going on. Do we do the same with blues? Most schools don't. I would love it if they did. We do have data. I think one elementary school I worked with in Lexington, Kentucky did that, charted both. And what was really interesting is when they set a goal for themselves, let's as a school give out 100 blues next week. When blues went up, yellows went down. There's a real negative relationship there. So I would love to see schools do that. Most schools don't, just because it's an extra chore. And you have to decide, is that realistic? Will we get out of it what we put into it? Great question. Here's what I would know at the end of the week if this was my school. I would know everybody who had a problem. I would know who were the people that saw the problems. I would know what the problem was, and I could continue down where did they happen? When did it happen? What did we do about it? What else would you like to know? Would you like to know what grade they're in? If grade is on your thing, then you could say, what grade levels had problems? Once that's in there, you can sort through this. First thing I do at the end of every week is I alphabetize this list to find my repeat offenders. And here you see Tanya has had 3 problems in the last week. So right now, I'll bet you that Tanya is known really well by 2 bus drivers. If we sit down as a faculty and say, who's having problems right now? You guys probably aren't talking about Tanya. You're talking about the kid who's had 15 of these, who just had a good week last week, he didn't have any. But he's had 1 million of them. You're talking about those kids. But the problem for us in missing Tanya is she is the most likely red zone kid of the future. When should we work on a kid who might be a red zone kid in the future? Now. So here's what we have to decide. How many times should a kid's name appear on our list for the year before we say, hey, let's pull that kid aside and talk to them and find out what's going on, and let's involve their parents, and at what point should we do that? We would like to think that that would mean a number that represents 15% of your school. So if you said in our school, if we set that number at 3, and we looked at all the referrals kids get in a year, if we set the number at 3 or more, that would identify 15% of the school. Then 3 would be your number. In some schools it'll be 10, in some schools it'll be 2. But we want to find yellow zone kids. Again, you don't need this to find red zone kids. You already know who they are before you do this. This is to help us find the kids that we haven't found yet, but we can still fix fairly easily. But I can also take this and just pull Tanya out. Now when we have a little conference on Tanya, I can tell you everything that we know, but that wouldn't be enough. If I was going to have a conference on Tanya, what I'd do is I'd call in who were Tanya's teachers. I'd call every teacher in, I'd call parent in, and I would just sit them all down. Remember what I said earlier, the best evidence we have of what's going on is what you tell us. So I would bring the people that know her in and I would ask them, what have you been seeing with her? Where does she do well? Where does she not do well? When is it likely to happen? And we would build a plan based upon what we said. So should we do a plan like that for every kid that has a problem behavior? No, you can't. Not realistic. Who should you do it for? You have to decide. How many times does a kid's name need to be on your list before you do that? And that'll be something your school has to decide. Just, how many problems do kids in your school have? But we can ask all these questions now for PBS at the school level. I can use my data to ask like this. How are things going? The blue bar represents last year's office referrals. The red bar represents this year's. In general, I feel like we're doing pretty well. But I'm still not satisfied. Maybe this just means we're not referring anymore. Maybe the principal told these people they weren't allowed to refer. So I want to go and I want to look at exactly what we did see. So I'm going to dig in. First of all, who? In my little spreadsheet, I can just click a button and get out a graph. Okay, here are your red zone kids. You've got 2 of them. You've got a set of yellow zone kids. The rest of them are probably kids that aren't having problems. What about types of problems? If you as a school want to go after the kinds of problems that most kids have, then your school should go after tardy. If your school says this year we're really going to put our focus on combs, then your school is probably going to spend a lot of time doing something that isn't going to give you much difference. In fact, it's not going to give you any difference because there were no combs problems last year. So we try to use our data to figure out where should we go and do something different. If we focused on tardies and we were able to cut tardies in half, we saved ourselves that much. But if you go after theft and cut it in half, now, so I'm not saying, so allow theft this year. I'm saying if you're going to really focus on teaching your kids and having routines and arrangements really focused around an issue, put it around the issue or issues that are going to give you the biggest change. Because guess who most of the people having these problems are? Right? We saw that early this morning. Those kids make up 50 to 80% of your problems. So 50 to 80% of these problems are those kids. So if we really focus on decreasing tardies and it works, we've made a bunch of these kids successful. That's what we want to focus on. If you go to when should we try doing new things, different things in our school? Again, this says you'll get the biggest bang for your buck if you do it around lunchtime. Look at all the problems happening around lunchtime. Who do you think is doing most of those? Again, they probably aren't all sitting at one table. That would make it real simple for us. They're spread out there, but we know yellow and red are the ones doing this. But instead of going after yellow and red, we go after the location and we ask ourselves, why do kids have problems at lunchtime? What are they doing? Well, I could go to my data and ask this question. What is the biggest problem we see between 12 and 1 in the cafeteria? And you could sort your data and you could find out exactly. Then you could say, okay, then we need to teach all of our kids to do this instead of that. And we're going to put this routine in place and have adults stand here instead of there. And we fix this, and then we fix this, that will fix these guys. So again, our concept here is don't go after them, go after the problems. Prevent the problems, prevent them from having problems. Where? This one says classroom. I would expect that. Kids are in the classroom the vast majority of the day, so wouldn't you expect that they'd have more problems there? I'm more interested in school-wide right now